Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure and an honor for me to introduce to you Dr. Helena Seli. Dr. Helena Seli is Associate Professor of Clinical Education of University of Southern California, of School of Education of University of Southern California. Her conference today is entitled Designing Structure to Support At-Risk Student Self-Regulation. You are very welcome, Helena. Thank you for all your knowledge. Thank you for all your knowledge you'll be sharing with us. And before I forget, you are going to have, after Dr. Helena Seli's session, after her conference, you will have a music session. So please stay connected. The music session will be very nice for our soul.
All right. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Give me just a second here. Uh-oh, I know how to do this. Here we go. Can everybody see the presentation, the PowerPoint slide?
Yes.
And it takes up the whole screen. You don't see any other things? Everything looks good? Okay.
Yes.
All right, very good. Well, let's start then. It's really a great pleasure to be here, although I'd obviously much more be in Brazil. I had dreams of it, hoping to be there in May, then hoping for November, but here we are. So I'm counting on next time on another invite. I'm sure my colleague Taylor AC agrees with me that we are expecting another invitation and want to be there in person. So the focus of my presentation today is, as is most of my scholarly focus, is on practitioners. And I know that in the audience today we have researchers, graduate students, but also teachers at different educational levels and education managers. So my focus today is primarily on supporting those of you who directly work with students. And I'm not going to be making assumptions that you know all the terminology that I will be presenting, so I will also take a brief moment to sort of review some key definitions. And speaking of definitions, as you can see in the title, I am saying supporting at-risk, and then I say at-promise students. So more about the title and the difference between the at-risk and at-promise students in the very upcoming slides. And by the way, in between me making a proposal to be with you today and the time of being here today, I was promoted to a full professor of clinical education. So that's a cause for celebration for me as well, in addition to being here today. All right, so going to the next slide. Let me just review my notes here. So the way that I have organized my presentation today is I'll first be reviewing the terms. What do we mean by at-risk versus at-promise students? I will then continue to address supporting self-regulation from two perspectives, supporting motivation and then supporting learning. And by supporting learning, I mean supporting the acquisition of knowledge and skills, as well as dispositions in some cases. My presentation today is grounded, and then we'll have some concluding thoughts and an opportunity to engage in questions and answers as well. My presentation today is grounded in three learning and motivation theories: cognitive, social cognitive, but also the socio-cultural approaches, which are, aside from behaviorism, probably the four major learning and motivation theories. And the purpose of my presentation, as I already stated, is to share, and I'm sure mostly remind those of you in the audience about effective practices in supporting students, especially the most vulnerable ones that could be called at risk or at promise. So in looking at the terms at-risk students, traditionally in education, we have used the term at-risk students to indicate those that may need more support than our typical students. So who are the students who are considered at risk? So at-risk students are typically those who are in danger of not graduating, not being promoted to the next grade, or not meeting their other education-related goals. Some characteristics of at-risk students are emotional or behavioral challenges, expressing disconnection and lack of interest in school, poor academic performance, irregular attendance. The term, though, at risk, communicates a deficit mindset and further could communicate some racist and classist ideas, especially in the context of what is happening in the United States today very loudly and clearly, but also in the rest of the world, including Brazil. The struggle for social justice for individuals from historically marginalized backgrounds and populations, who also tend to be overrepresented among those students considered at risk. In the context of the United States, individuals from marginalized backgrounds are those who identify as Black or African American, Latinx, other people of color, including specifically indigenous populations, commonly referred to as BIPOC, B-I-P-O-C, which refers to Black, Indigenous, and people of color. People of color, or the POC, POC. The two additional letters, though, the B and the I, Black and Indigenous, highlight the specific experiences and struggles of Black and Indigenous people, which can go unacknowledged in conversations about race, but the groups that are disproportionately at risk for being marginalized. And the term therefore acknowledges that in the United States, not people of color face equal levels of injustice. And so again, the term recognizes that Black Indigenous people are severely impacted and more and disproportionately impacted by systemic racial injustices. In Brazil, similar differences and similar challenges exist based on my research in preparing for this presentation today. You have 5 racial groups among whom there's a racial hierarchy. You also have a history of colonialization and slavery, and all of this has brought about specific groups being marginalized, as of course you here recognize. It looks also, based on my research, that the conversation about race Brazil has become closely intertwined with conversations about poverty and class, as it is in the United States. So the race ethnic background is naturally one of the predominant sort of likely characteristics of students who we consider at risk. Aside from the racial ethnic background, there are other characteristics that can place a student at risk. Special needs, such as a student having a diagnosis of autism or an attention deficit disorder, low socioeconomic status, sexual orientation or gender identity that does not follow the accepted social norms, or other characteristics. The main problem with the term of at risk, of naming these vulnerable, potentially vulnerable students at risk, is that it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. By using the term at risk, we may be creating expectations of failure for indeed our most vulnerable students. So instead of using the term at risk, many educators, as well as legislators, so folks who work in Congress, in the state legislature, have shifted to using the term at promise or at potential. Switching the term at risk to at promise doesn't mean that educators do no longer acknowledge the students' disadvantages, but language matters, and we know that using an asset-based language is important. This is a similar sort of narrative in saying achievement gap versus an opportunity gap, which indeed leads to differences in achievement based on a history of marginalization. So the focus has moved in the switch from achievement to opportunity gap has moved from the student, the focus at the student, to the society that has failed to support the students. And perhaps in the Q&A session after my presentation, I'd like to hear any discourse that may be taking place in Brazil about the naming of the most vulnerable students. The term at promise has gained significant momentum, and in California, in fact, where I am located, as of January of this year, all uses of the term at risk in the state educational codes have been changed to at promise, a term that supporters of this term argue is less stigmatizing. However, in California's education code, at promise still refers to students who may fail to earn a high school diploma for a variety of reasons, including irregular attendance, past record of academic underachievement, economic disadvantage, low scores on math and English standardized tests. Naturally, really, before we go into how to support the self-regulation of students, at promise, the term should not be used to label students, and students should be referred to as students and focus on the circumstances that may keep them from achieving their highest educational potential. The reality is that, though, that all students face some kind of risk. And so for the purposes of this presentation today, we'll keep the students who face the most risk in focus. All right. So let's move on to addressing self-regulation. So in my presentation today, I'll be looking at supporting self-regulation for at promise students from two angles: supporting learning, in other words, the acquisition of knowledge and skills, and supporting motivation. And motivation can, of course, be critical in starting the process of acquisition of knowledge and skills, but is as important to not only start the process of learning, but also to continue it, to persist at it, and to invest the necessary mental effort to learn. As I'm sure those of you here who are working closely with students know, it's just not a matter of beginning, starting, but also the process of continuing. Learning and motivation are reciprocal processes, and both are important. And we know, in fact, that motivation can account for up to 50% or more in achievement. All too often, certainly in higher education, educators may believe that when there's an achievement issue or a performance issue, that the student may not have the knowledge and skills, where in reality, the challenges often lie in motivation. So the issue may be in not having the motivation to either start the engagement or to persist at it. So therefore, I will address motivation specifically and in fact, start with it. So let's get to supporting motivation. So what is motivation? Again, there's different ways to define the term, but for purposes of today, I'd like to anchor it in the term used by Pintrich and Schunk, two preeminent educational psychological researchers who define motivation as the process whereby goal-directed activity is instigated and sustained. In other words, put simply, motivation is the process that gets us started, keeps us going, and helps us to invest an adequate amount of mental effort to achieve our goals. As educators, we we need to look at motivation from a situated or a context-based perspective. So we know that students may be highly motivated in some areas, such as language arts, but maybe highly unmotivated in mathematics. So the statement that the student is just not motivated is rarely, if ever, correct. It is true that some students may become amotivated, acquire hopelessness, but typically students' motivation can be changed with changes in the context. Again, highlighting our role, our critical role as educators in supporting students' motivation. Motivation also needs to be considered a process rather than a product. So with that definition in mind, let's move to concrete strategies in supporting the most vulnerable at-promise students and their motivation. In supporting motivation, I rely on findings from both social cognitive and socio-cultural theories. So very importantly, looking at the role of culture and context. And I'll be addressing six specific ways in which to support at-promise student self-regulation. As you can see, number one, creating an affirming and caring rather than a punitive culture, reducing the potential of stereotype threat, building value for content, enhancing student self-efficacy, encouraging attributions to effort rather than ability, and implementing collaborative learning. So those of you who know the EdPsych body of research, these are really sort of the usual suspects, so to speak, efficacy and value primarily in how we support motivation. And I'll place this all in the context of supporting the most vulnerable students. So the first recommendation is to create an affirming and caring rather than a punitive culture. So one of the ways in which we communicate with our students before we ever meet them is our syllabus. If you're in high school, here as a high school teacher, you may be using the syllabus, but you're certainly using a syllabus if you're here as a higher education faculty. The language in the syllabus is powerful and can reinforce and reproduce the norms and rules that generally align with the experience of high-achieving students, who in the United States tend to be from white middle-class backgrounds, so not students from marginalized backgrounds. For students who have experienced exclusion, marginalization, discrimination, and indeed oppression in educational settings and elsewhere, the language in the syllabus can reinforce their sense of separation and a doubt in their ability to succeed. So changing from a language of expectations and the corresponding implicit sort of punitive actions to a more caring, affirming language can affirm the sense of belonging of our most vulnerable students. Again, the students at potential, for whatever reason, their race, ethnic background, their ability status, their socioeconomic status. So changing the language can communicate the belief that they are expected to succeed and validate their pursuit of education at any level, but particularly a college degree. After all, there's a strong chance that our at-promise students are first-generation students who may experience the imposter syndrome, the belief in which or a psychological pattern in which they doubt their skills and has this persistent internalized fear of being exposed as a fraud, of not belonging, either in high school, because most of their peers did not complete high school, or certainly not in college. So let's take a look at some examples here. So the first row on the table. In this course, you are expected to, as opposed to, together, we will examine. etc., etc. So whatever is your content area. You can see the language switch from a rather punitive to a much more affirming and caring. Let's take a look at the second line. You're expected to participate in failure to comply will result in the loss of participation points. Versus, and for purposes of translation, I'll read it out loud, which I normally wouldn't do for slides, but here we go. You all come with experiential knowledge in the context of this course. It's important for your own and others' learning that you actively participate in class discussions by asking questions and contributing to the discussion. Okay? So you can hopefully see the difference in the tone of students who come from, privileged backgrounds can handle the language of expectations and the resulting punitive actions much better than students who come from marginalized backgrounds, for whom this will create stress and anxiety, which certainly will not support their performance. So I invite us all to review our syllabi. Is it welcoming? Does it emphasize a partnership in which a teacher or a faculty member and students work together to ensure success? Does your syllabus convey your willingness to work individually with students who need extra help? So is it just office hours, or I hold office hours in order to support those of you who may have additional questions? Please don't hesitate to request office hours with me, right? Does it validate the student's ability to succeed? Does it communicate an expectation of success? Or does it emphasize expectations and lay out the punishments that occur if expectations are not met? Does it use language that sort of scolds the students for potential behavioral infractions? What is the tone of your syllabus? So as the first step for supporting students' motivation, particularly the students who are most vulnerable, look at the tone of your syllabus before you ever meet your students. The next one that I'd like to address is supporting motivation from reducing the potential of stereotype threat. And again, I'm not assuming that you have existing knowledge about these terms, so I'll just very briefly discuss what it is. Stereotype threat, as introduced by Claude Steele, another preeminent psychologist, is a phenomenon in which a person's concern for confirming a negative stereotype about a group to which they belong. And obviously there's an intersectionality happening. So somebody may be a female from a marginalized background in math. Now you've got two stereotypes: women are not good at math, and people like me, whether being of Black background or indigenous background, are not good at math. So you've got multiple threats in terms of stereotypes. So stereotype threat is really essentially a concern, a fear of confirming that negative stereotype about them that can lead the individual to underperform on a challenging assessment or test. As some of you may know here, many of you know, this phenomenon has been demonstrated in laboratory research and classroom settings, as well as non-academic contexts. A stereotype threat can affect anyone, but particularly students who identify with the groups that are underrepresented. It may be especially vulnerable to the effects of stereotype threats. For at-promise students, there are likely to be several stereotypes based on their socioeconomic background, ability status, if they do have a diagnosis of autism, if they have sensory special needs, visual, auditory special needs, racial ethnic identity that they may fear they might confirm. Steele and Aronson, another preeminent researcher, pointed out that in numerous investigations, stereotype threat does really not reduce effort, but in fact, it makes individuals try harder because they want to invalidate the stereotype. And this then shifts their cognitive resources from the task at hand, whether it is a math problem or an essay they're writing, to sort of concerns of confirming the stereotypes and that persistent rumination. So in order to reduce stereotype threat, teach the students about stereotype threat, forewarn them about it, so that they attribute their anxiety as they're engaging in a task to the stereotype threat rather than to their lack of ability, for example. Teach students to reappraise that anxiety as a potential facilitator of strong performance rather than a barrier about it. But most importantly, forewarn students that you may experience this as you engage in high-stakes testing. Secondly, create a learning environment in which mistakes and missteps are valued as opportunities for learning. That's very, very important. So if a student contributes an answer that is not correct, follow up with questions that will help the student explain their rationale and identify any sort of wrong turns or missteps that they took while coming up with the answer. And communicate often with your students about the value, about the usefulness of wrong answers, because they help us illuminate incomplete understanding and spur us to learn more. Naturally, avoid any references to lack of ability, such as, you know, some students, I know that some students have trouble with math. I'm not good at math. Naturally, you want to avoid making any of such references to what Carol Dweck at Stanford would call a fixed mindset, that students are somehow inherently not good at math, not good at language, not good at science. And a little bit more about the importance of shifting to emphasizing effort in just another slide. Provide motivating feedback that is private, specific, timely, and that communicates an expectation of success. So when commenting on student work, particularly in the work of students that you may identify as most vulnerable among the students that you teach, aim to provide very specific feedback that combines an assurance that you're providing critical feedback because you have high standards. Provide specific commentary indicating where the student's work does and does not meet the standards, and most importantly, confidence that the student can meet those standards. This type of feedback has been shown to improve students' motivation and ultimately self-regulation, and also reduce the students' perceptions about instructor bias. And then lastly, prime with positive, congruent role models who refute stereotypes. So provide examples of students who are like the most vulnerable students, the at-promise students, who initially struggled and questions whether or not they belonged in the course or at the institution, but ultimately succeeded. Include narratives from diverse students, for example, in terms of race, gender, level of ability, and expose students to successful role models from their group who refute negative stereotypes. All right, so now that you've set a affirming and caring environment, and when appropriate, also forewarn students that there is a very powerful phenomenon that you may experience, which researchers call stereotype threat. Let's take a look at how to support student self-efficacy. We know that self-efficacy, our task-specific self-confidence, as introduced by Albert Bandura, a big figure in educational psychology and psychology on the whole, so self-efficacy is one of the strongest predictors of self-regulated performance, our ability to sort of regulate our behavior, self-discipline, motivate ourselves. And a clarification for those who are not familiar with the body of research about self-efficacy, self-efficacy is different from self-esteem or self-worth, which of course may be particular areas of challenge for at-promise students, right? Many at-promise students, most vulnerable students, may struggle with self-esteem and self-worth as well. But self-efficacy is different. Self-efficacy is a cognitive assessment, cognitive appraisal of a likelihood to succeed in a specific task not in life overall, but in a specific task. And as that is an important, it is an important predictor of self-regulation. And so it's important to focus on efforts to support student self-efficacy, particularly those who are at promise. We know that self-efficacy has four primary sources: previous positive and successful experiences in the particular domain or with a particular task, vicarious experiences of similar others succeeding, supportive feedback from teachers, educators, professors, coaches, mentors, and then the physiological state overall, sort of a sense of assessing one's excitement, whether it is a threat or whether it is a supportive state to engage in performance. So based on this knowledge of where we gain our sense of self-efficacy, here are specific 3 strategies through which we can support students. Because the most important source of self-efficacy are the learner's own positive task-related experiences, which we can call mastery experiences, aim to create those positive experiences by providing instructional support or scaffolding early on, building multiple opportunities for practice, and then gradually removing the support. So this obviously comes primarily from the sociocultural theory. So for example, in a mathematics class, by not only demonstrating in class how to solve problems and then sending students home to do homework, but also solving problems as a class and providing students these small experiences of success, and then assigning homework to be done without the instructor's immediate scaffolding, which is much more likely to be difficult for students, right? So supporting them in class and having experiences of success and reinforcing those experiences, because again, we know that self-efficacy gets built via incremental experiences of success. Along similar lines of enabling students to experience success, design frequent, low-stakes assessments with specific and private feedback. Very commonly in higher education particularly, assignments are very infrequent over the term. You may have a midterm and a final and a paper. And all the assignments are extremely high stakes. So where the added stress and anxiety only further decreases the at-promise students' chances of success. However, frequent, every week, small assignment, small low-stakes quizzes are much more likely to provide opportunities to experience success and through that build self-efficacy. And this is obviously critical for all students, but particularly for students who are most vulnerable. And then, because one of the critical sources of self-efficacy are experiences of observing similar others succeed, whether the similar others are along with their racial ethnic background, their level of ability, so students with special needs, observing other students with special needs succeed, students from low socioeconomic backgrounds that were not expected to succeed, succeeding. So providing opportunities for your students to observe a similar and coping model, engaging in behavior is important. So what do we mean by coping rather than mastery models? In other words, coping individuals are those who were not successful at the beginning or right away, but through persistence and self-regulation succeeded. Observing a mastery model, somebody who gets it right the first time, is not as helpful for any learners, but especially for learners at promise. So look to use role models who kind of struggled for a while, but then succeeded. So coping rather than mastery models. We know that aside from self-efficacy, the learner's value for content is another significant and one of the preeminent predictors of motivation and therefore self-regulation. So Jacqueline Eccles, based on her expectancy value theory by Jackie Eccles and her colleagues, tells us that what predicts our engagements are beliefs about whether we value tasks we are asked to undertake and whether we, of course, believe that we can succeed at them. I've already addressed supporting at-promise students' self-efficacy, so the second dimension, task value, is addressed by this slide. So here are some specific steps that you can do to increase the value of the task, whether it is the value of the course or the specific unit that you are teaching for students who are at promise. The key to implementing the first strategy, creating materials and activities that are relevant and useful to the learners, connected to their interests and based on real-world example, is to know your students. You can approach building from value from two perspectives, building intrinsic and building extrinsic value. To build intrinsic value, determine what are your students passionate about? What music do they listen to? What video games do they play? What shows do they watch? As much as possible, weave references to their instruction into your, to their interest rather, into your instruction. And your understanding of their interests also communicates that you care about them, which many at-promise students may not have felt in their previous educational experiences. To build extrinsic value, explain why what you are teaching is useful for them, and indeed what they may risk by not gaining the knowledge and skills, or at the minimum, that they want to earn a good grade as a path for them to continue their education. And one specific way to obviously to build extrinsic value or utility value is to explain how your students might use the knowledge and skills gained in everyday life. So do your best to identify real-world examples that you can use in your instruction and then explicitly tell your students how what you are learning relates to their real-life experiences, their everyday experiences. And finally, for building value, we know from decades of research about one of the most reliable ways of building interest, which is similar to intrinsic value, is the instructor's level of enthusiasm. So be sure to reflect on the degree to which you model enthusiasm, interest, and value for the task, because we know that it's contagious. All right, moving next, and I think this is my final slide for supporting motivation as I look at the time. For complex, for difficult, and novel tasks, so tasks that your learners have not previously engaged with, implement collaborative learning. This recommendation has both sociocultural and social cognitive theory underpinnings. According to Lev Vygotsky, students are able to perform at higher intellectual levels when they are engaging in collaborative situations than when they are working alone. So collaborative learning gives students opportunities to engage in dialogue, and they can take charge of their own learning. Students exchange their ideas and thoughts actively through group activities directed towards a common goal, such as solving a science or a math problem. And their active participation in these collaborative activities advances their understanding of the content. What is also absent in collaborative group-based learning is the focus on evaluating the individual student, which reduces the stress, anxiety, as well as reduces the potential of stereotype threat, which we of course know is very much there for the most vulnerable at-promise students. From the social cognitive perspective, coming back to self-efficacy, one of the biggest predictors of self-regulation, Bandura established that vicarious experience or observing others succeed is one of the 4 major sources of self-efficacy. Vicarious experiences are important sources of self-efficacy, particularly when your learners lack the experiences in a specific area, such as new difficult tasks, whether it's a new higher level of math problems or another new task for them. Collaborative learning boosts student self-efficacy because it brings both their direct, personal, as well as vicarious experiences of the other group members. And vicarious experiences are important sources of self-efficacy, again, through the process of collaboration. Students observe the others, however small, successes of other members and learn from them. All right, and finally, for motivation, gotta speed it up here. Encourage attributions to effort rather than ability. Attributions are our explanations for success or lack thereof, and differ along the dimensions of internal versus external. So I succeeded because of myself versus my instructor who doesn't like me. I succeeded because of controllable versus uncontrollable, and stable, non-changing versus unstable and changing causes. So one of the most dangerous attributions that at-promise students may make is that they're simply not smart enough to do well in math, writing, science, etc. In other words, they're making an internal, uncontrollable, and stable attribution to lack of ability versus still an internal, but controllable and unstable attribution to effort, or really self-regulation. Carol Dweck naturally calls it fixed versus growth mindset. So as educators, it's very, very important to provide feedbacks that redirects attributions from ability, I'm not good at this, to effort, including using effective learning strategies. And really that your success comes not from how intelligent and how smart you are, but your level of effort and how smart you learn, how smart you study. In other words, using effective learning strategies. And very importantly, communicate that learning strategies can absolutely be learned. So with that, and a little bit of a desire to speed it up a little bit, I am going to shift to supporting learning, which again, I generally mean the specific now acquisition of knowledge and skills. And there's really two main areas that I'd like to highlight in the remaining few minutes here. And of course, these two are of course not a comprehensive list, but just something that I chose to focus on today, particularly with a focus on supporting students at Promise. So as I mentioned, and I ended the motivation component, it's critical to communicate that success comes from self-regulation and use of effective learning strategies and knowing when to use which strategies. So be explicit about how to optimize study via meaningful learning strategies. Higher education faculty particularly make the mistake of assuming that students know how to study, that they come into, certainly this is the case in the United States, that they come from high school, so they pretty much should know how to study. With the difference of a teacher-regulated environment, such as K-12 schools generally are, to higher education where it's entirely self-regulated, many students fail because they haven't acquired the effective learning strategies to engage in self-regulated learning. So this slide presents the differences between rote learning and meaningful learning. So as you can see, rote learning really is rehearsal, just copying material, taking notes as you hear them, underlining, highlighting, creating flashcards, and pretty much reciting material, learning definitions exactly as they are. While many of you know here, meaningful learning strategies can be categorized broadly into elaboration and organization. So supporting the practices of paraphrasing, using the learner's own language to define, obviously still using critical term, but not simply reciting the definition, but paraphrasing it so that it becomes more meaningful for the learner. Creating analogies, creating comparisons between pieces of knowledge learned, again, tying it to prior knowledge, summarizing in the learner's own words, note making versus simply note taking, And very importantly, the practice of self-testing. So actively engaging in learning rather than sort of passively conducting learning. And then as strategies for organization, selecting the main idea, creating an outline, and very importantly, using representations such as matrices, hierarchies, and sequences to impose order on material. This slide itself could be a whole presentation by itself. So unfortunately, I won't be able to pause here too much longer, but just if you haven't been exposed to bodies of research about rote versus meaningful learning, I definitely encourage you to dive into this material so that you can support your students and explicitly teach these strategies. So let's take a look at a syllabus that presents explicit ways of being, explicit ways rather of optimizing studies. So, all right, so in the interest, again, after a translation, I will read these slides. So this is an example from a graduate level course, a master's course, for students who seek to improve learning and motivation in the organizations that they work for. So from the syllabus, review of learning strategies for this unit. Review the slides before you start the readings. Hint, print out the slides to write down notes as you read and bring them to class. As you complete the readings, write down a note or two, write down one or two syntheses of major ideas. Use the note-taking scaffold. I'll read this and then I'll visit sort of what is being presented here. Answer the following reflective questions in preparation for class. What are some examples from everyday life where principles of behaviorism are applied? So obviously this is a unit on the theory of behaviorism, which is, one of the foundations of psychology, and obviously has a lot of problematic associations as well to ideas that are nowadays being interrogated. What kinds of performance problems in organizations might be resolved from a behavioral perspective? What questions do you have about the use and application of behavioral approaches? Think about how the principles of behaviorism apply in the context of your organizational problem. Write down notes, bring them to class, and be ready to share. So what you can see here in this slide, let me just go to my notes again here, is that the instructor is communicating clearly the recommended order, as you can see in here, the recommended order, specific strategies such as printing out resources. The instructor is providing reflective prompts and ways to connect the information with what the students are interested in and why they're in college, which is to improve learning and motivation in their organizations. The instructor is also referring to a supportive resource designed specifically for this class, the note-taking scaffold, which is a specific way of how we recommend them reading empirical articles and taking down sort of the key ideas and observations, which again, is a specific resource that we designed and taught students how to use rather than assuming that they know how to read empirical articles. And further, the instructor here does hold them accountable for engaging in the meaningful learning strategies by asking them to bring notes to class, indicating that peer discussions will occur. And then finally, supporting learner control of the pacing of material. So supporting the acquisition of knowledge and skills by providing the learner as much control in the learning process as possible. So in higher education particularly, professors control the pace, just as you are following me right now. Some of you may be struggling with the simultaneous translation. Perhaps some are even taking notes and you wish you could pause me while you finish taking the notes and then continue the presentation. Or some of you may be having a difficult time keeping up if you lack sort of the prior knowledge specifically about the terms and wanted more time to sort of explore the definitions. So one way to support our learners, particularly those who are at promise, is to provide them control of the pacing of material. And flipped instruction does just that. And I'm sure that many of you are already implementing flipped instruction. So as a review of flipped instruction, here's the order of instructional activities. Students will review the recorded lecture here. So you might recommend students printing out the slides or being ready to take notes in the PowerPoint, pause the recording, play portions of it back as needed. They review the lecture ahead of time, and this may work effectively as sort of foreshadowing, creating the schemas about the topic. Next, students complete the readings. The first two steps, of course, can be conducted in the reverse order, and you might explain it to the students. You have two options. You might watch the recorded lecture and then do the readings, or switch it so that the recorded lecture can serve as a reinforcement. And you might recommend that students experiment which order works better for you. So being very explicit about how to study for the class. Very often, what occurs in flipped instructions is that students complete a retrieval practice via a knowledge check or a low-stakes quiz. So this can be very low, like the 10 quizzes in a course may account for no more than 15 or 20% of points, so as to not create anxiety. However, the knowledge check holds the students accountable for doing the reading and the viewing, and also gives the instructor the knowledge about any patterns of misunderstanding or misconceptions that might be needed to address before application. And then the students come to class to really engage in the review of the concepts as necessary, and then application activities, which again give you an opportunity as an instructor to make the learning meaningful, to relate what they learned to real life challenges, to things that the students care about. And this is particularly important for all, but particularly for our most vulnerable or at-promise students. All right, thank you so much for your attention today. I wish you much effort in supporting your students, however old they are, whatever grade they are in K-12, whether they are adults, and hope that you've gained or being reminded, hope that you gained or were reminded of some of tips and practices to support at-promise students. As we say at the University of Southern California, I can't fight it, fight on. And I'm ready for any questions or whatever may be the next steps. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Helena. I would like to congratulate you for such a wonderful conference, and I believe what you said, Helena, it will be very, very helpful for us, especially to deal with our education problems that have been even more severe due to the coronavirus. So we are facing a very bad scenario, and your practical information, your contribution will be very, very useful for us. I have no doubts about that. So, and before I ask some questions to you that the audience posed to me, I would like also to let you know that people love your conference. I have thousands of very nice comments about it, so I should let you give this positive feedback before. And then I will translate the questions to you.
Wonderful. And my slides are also, I'll be more than happy to share my slides.
Okay,
however they may be useful.
Okay, thank you so much. One question we have now in the chat is, I will try to take a look in orders. One professor asked, how do you work with that in your practice? How do you support these students when you have them? How have been your practice about that?
I mean, I very explicitly start everything from the design of the syllabus, as most of us always start. So I start with very clear learning outcomes that are supported by the assignments via which the students would demonstrate the outcomes. And I make sure that the assignments, there's multiple assignments, that they're low stakes, meaning not one assignment worth 50 points or 50% of the class rather. So I strategically, in keeping particularly in mind students who come to, I mostly teach in master's and doctoral programs, and we have a lot of students from marginalized backgrounds, Black students, students from indigenous backgrounds, who are the first in their family to not only get a bachelor's degree, but certainly a doctorate degree, and may definitely suffer from the imposter syndrome. I don't know if I belong here. So I very explicitly strategize multiple opportunities for them to conduct the work, to get supportive feedback, so that through the course I can support them, whether it is the quality of their writing, about the way they think about things, whatever it may be. So that's one of the primary things that I do this. I also choose readings where if it's an empirical reading, I make sure that the population of study is not always the white undergraduates, which is very typical in psychology, for example. I make sure that the population that is presented as the participants or the subjects in the research is as congruent to their experience as possible. And then very importantly, I look at the tone of my syllabus. Do I look at it as setting up a power hierarchy between myself and the students? Or do I position us to be as collaborators and partners as much as possible, recognizing that indeed I am still the professor and I will grade them. But I very much am aware of the tone that I present to my students.
Thank you. I also would like to ask, the next question is, if you have some research evidence or your opinion about what are the beliefs from the teachers of these students at Promise?
I mean, very often teachers, and I am not a teacher. I did work as a teacher for a while before I had some teaching experience, teacher experience before I joined higher education. So my hats are off to teachers. They don't have an easy job. With that said, there are teachers who sort of engage in making external attributions about their students' lack of success. So if there's a group of students who are at Promise, whether because of their race, ethnic background, socioeconomic status, or other, identifiers characteristics, unfortunately, teachers can make external attributions to, I can't do anything. The students are not motivated. They're not smart enough in math. Their families don't support education. So there's nothing that I can do. Instead of making more internal controllable attributions to what can I do as a teacher to change the motivation, because motivation is context-based. We're not looking at motivation as a disposition, as a character trait of students. As educators, we need to recognize the power of context in students' motivation. So that I find is, and there's lots of research about that, sort of implicit bias. So this is not something that teachers recognize themselves, that I'm making external attributions, meaning blaming the students. It's an implicit bias that we all often bring to our engagement with vulnerable students. So we need to become aware of our implicit bias.
Thank you. And the next question is, if you know, by the way, if there is any research regarding creative process and self-efficacy in being carried out at University of Southern California.
Let me just read this again. Creative process and
creative process and self-efficacy. If, by the way, there is any research being carried out, let's see.
So there's absolutely a link in that self-efficacy. The level of student self-efficacy predicts their level of mental effort, right? And their persistence at a task. The more confident I am, the more likely I am to struggle and persist at struggling with solving a task, whether it is, innovative ways, creative ways, as you're saying, innovative, creating ways to solve a problem. So there's absolutely a positive relationship, meaning the higher one's self-efficacy, the more likely you are to engage in, innovative thinking. I can't think of anybody specifically conducting research at it right now, but I'll be, and I'm sure my colleague Taylor here can jump in as well about some articles that have already been established about sort of level of self-efficacy and engaging in innovation. And I'm sure that has been established in other contexts as well, such as organizational problem solving. And not only individual self-efficacy, but also collective efficacy. How efficacious are we as a group? If we're facing a problem in an organization, how efficacious are we as a group? Therefore, how likely are we to produce innovative ways to create, to solve problems?
Thank you so much. And we have another question that is, how can we change teachers' mindset about fixed mindsets about students at promise?
The first step, as we always say, is recognition that we as educators, because I'm not outside of that, that we as educators engage in implicit bias, that we look at students and based on how they present or what we know about them, we are likely to engage in implicit bias. There's whole bodies of articles, and I'll be happy to follow up with some emails with specific articles about how to overcome stereotypical thinking. And there's specific strategies of how to change our stereotypical thinking. One of the specific ones that comes to mind is think of counter-stereotypic examples. So if you are teaching a student who presents as likely this student can't be good at math because of their gender, their race, ethnic background, etc. I'm sure you have come across students who were good at math, as it were, who succeeded at math. So as immediately as you recognize yourself engaging in stereotype, think of counter-stereotypic examples. And that enables you to sort of shift that mindset and start looking at how can I support that student's effort and self-regulation rather than sort of back off and say, well, there's nothing I can do. But there's the specific ways of changing stereotypic thinking that have been empirically validated as kind of getting us out of that implicit bias.
Thank you so much. Let me see if I have one more question here or not, or it's just comments. Everybody's saying that's wonderful. A lot of nice comments. I read one to you because it's in English. Professor Seli, you and Professor Ace are an inspirations for us. We can feel how passionate you are about this content. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and motivation. This is one that I found in English. So I don't see any other question. I just see comments and wonderful comments. I'm very glad. I would say it was a big success. Thank you so much for that, for sharing your knowledge with us. It has been a wonderful opportunity for us to have you, and I think what you said to us, it's very important, especially at these difficult times we are facing. we have to, the situations of the schools are very bad. When we come back to classes, we have to be very, very attentive to all of these points, because we have a lot of educational problems in Brazil, and they are much more aggravated now. There is no doubts about that. So thank you so much for your thoughts, your insights, your kindness. It has been a pleasure working with you, constructing this conference, like exchanging emails with you and Taylor. It has been a very nice experience. You both have been very kind to me. Thank you so much. And I would like to finish the session and ask and invite you to listen to the music session.
Absolutely. It's the best we can do under the circumstances, right? Hey, Taylor. It's the best we can do under the circumstances.
And I hope everybody likes this music as a gift to our souls.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Really great job. It was delightful to hear your speech.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, I do care about students who are at Promise.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So is the music going to be here, or do we have to go to a different room?
No, you can stay here.
Oh, okay.
Everything everything departs from here.
A Netflix já zerei umas 2 vezes. O WhatsApp já não aguento mais falar. No Instagram tem toda live o tempo todo. As fake news que não param de chegar. O meu vizinho rola sempre o mesmo som. O sertanejo e o famoso batidão. Tem um cachorro que não para de latir. E ainda tem um papagaio a repetir. Madalena, por favor, me dá um sinal. Uma dica se algum dia isso tudo irá passar. Não aguento mais tanto afastamento, tanto tédio, fico em casa o dia inteiro de matar. Que vontade de voltar pra minha vida, meu trabalho, meu estresse, um dia aglomerar. Tô com saudade da minha tia, da minha avó, até mesmo do meu chefe, não dá pra acreditar. Madalena, por favor, me dá um sinal. Uma dica se algum dia isso tudo irá passar. Não aguento mais tanto afastamento, tanto tédio, fico em casa o dia inteiro de matar. Que vontade de voltar pra minha vida, meu trabalho, meu estresse, um dia aglomerar. Tô com saudade da minha tia, da minha avó, e até mesmo do meu chefe, não dá pra acreditar. Helena, por favor, me dá um sinal, uma dica se algum dia isso irá passar. Não aguento mais tanto afastamento, tanto tédio, fico em casa o dia inteiro de matar. Que vontade de voltar pra minha vida, meu trabalho, meu estresse, e de aglomerar. Tô com saudade da minha tia, da minha avó, e até mesmo do meu chefe, não dá pra acreditar.
Eu gostaria de agradecer a todos. I would like to thank everybody agradecer a todos e desejar que tenhamos todos amanhã um ótimo dia e até amanhã, um bom descanso para todos. So, goodbye and have a nice rest, and see you tomorrow for our last day.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye. Nice having you today as well.
Yeah.
All right. Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.